The year was 1476, and the city of Florence was abuzz with whispers. In the heart of the city, a young artist named Leonardo da Vinci found himself at the center of a scandal that would forever change his life. Accused of practicing sodomy, a crime that could have seen him burned at the stake, Leonardo was dragged into the public eye. The charge was serious, and the city's gossip mills were in overdrive. But what few knew was that this denunciation might have been a covert attack on the powerful Lorenzo de Medici, the ruler of Florence. Leonardo was no stranger to Florence's elite circles. He had been apprenticed to the studio school of Verrocchio, where his meticulous artistry quickly made a name for him. But it wasn't just his talent that set him apart. Leonardo's striking physical beauty, self-confidence, and flamboyant style made him a standout in a city where modesty was the norm. Even Lorenzo de Medici, the influential patron of the arts, had taken notice of Leonardo's exceptional gifts. However, Lorenzo himself adhered to the Medici style laid down by his grandfather, Cosimo. Dress plainly and attract no attention to yourself. For pageants, Lorenzo would dress in splendor, but his everyday wear was a stark contrast to Leonardo's peacock-like dress sense. Despite their differences, Lorenzo's support for Leonardo was unwavering. When the young artist found himself in trouble, Lorenzo likely intervened to protect him, though the exact nature of this intervention remains a mystery. The case was never brought to trial, but the stigma of the accusation lingered. For Leonardo, who had already faced the challenge of being an illegitimate child, this public scandal was a harsh reminder of the judgment that followed him. Leonardo's early life was marked by a blend of extraordinary talent and personal challenges. Brought up in the countryside, he had a yokel's accent and a poor education, which made him stand out in the sophisticated circles of Florence. His lack of formal education, particularly in Latin, was a point of contention among the city's intellectuals. Yet, Leonardo's insatiable curiosity and hunger for knowledge pushed him to learn through observation and hands-on experience. He studied the mechanics of machines, the intricacies of building structures, and the principles of anatomy, all through his keen eyes and tireless investigation. Despite the initial wariness between Leonardo and Lorenzo, the young artist's talent could not be ignored. Lorenzo invited Leonardo to stay at the Palazzo Medici, a move that not only offered protection, but also placed him in the company of other renowned artists like Botticelli. Leonardo's friendship with Botticelli was surprising, given that he did not particularly admire the older artist's work. It was through Botticelli, however, that Leonardo was introduced to the works of Masaccio, which profoundly influenced his approach to art. Masaccio's ability to bring figures to life on the canvas with living curves and shaded volume was a revelation to Leonardo, who began to develop his own unique style. In 1479, Leonardo received a significant commission from Lorenzo to paint the Adoration of the Magi for the Church of San Donato at Scapito. The contrast between Leonardo's version and that of Botticelli was stark. While Botticelli's composition was orderly and decorous, Leonardo's was a chaotic and emotional scene, with figures overcome by the miraculous presence of the divine. Despite the Dominican friars' entreaties and threats, Leonardo's interest in the project waned, and the painting remained unfinished, a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Recognizing the need to protect Leonardo from further conflicts in Florence, Lorenzo recommended him to the new ruler of Milan, Lodovico Sforza, known as Il Moro. Milan, a city booming with industry and culture, offered Leonardo a fresh start. Unlike the cultural snobbery of Florence, Milan's more relaxed environment allowed the young artist to thrive. Lodovico Sforza, intrigued by Leonardo's multifaceted talents, took an immediate liking to him, and Leonardo reciprocated. In Milan, Leonardo's full potential began to blossom. He was commissioned to design a bronze statue of Francesco Sforza, the founder of the Sforza dynasty, and to paint the Last Supper for the refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie. These projects, along with his numerous sketches and designs, showcased his genius. Leonardo's work on The Last Supper was a masterpiece, capturing the profound and living emotions of the apostles. However, the innovative techniques he used for the fresco proved problematic, and the painting began to deteriorate within decades. Leonardo's time in Milan was also marked by his personal relationships. He took on a young servant named Giacomo Salai, who, despite his mischievous and thieving ways, became a close companion and eventually a lover. The bond between them was complex, but it provided Leonardo with a measure of personal happiness. In Milan, Leonardo was free to explore his vast interests, from engineering and anatomy to botany and astronomy. His notebooks, filled with detailed observations and innovative ideas, reveal a mind that saw no boundaries between art and science. For Leonardo, the painter was the supreme scientist, capable of perceiving and recording the world in its every detail. This vision, though ambitious, was never fully realized, but it laid the groundwork for the scientific method that would emerge in the centuries to come. Leonardo's time in Milan was a period of immense growth and creativity, but it was also a time of constant exploration and unfinished projects. His inability to complete many of his greatest works was not a sign of failure, but a testament to his boundless curiosity and the depth of his vision. For Leonardo, the pursuit of knowledge and the exploration of the unknown were more important than the final product. His legacy, however, endures through the few works he did complete and the countless ideas he left behind, all of which continue to inspire and fascinate the world to this day. In the late 1400s, Florence was a city of transformation. The air buzzed with new ideas, new art, and new possibilities. But beneath the excitement, there was also confusion and resentment, especially among the poor. The city was changing, and not everyone was happy about it. Amidst this turmoil, a young man named Girolamo Savonarola emerged, offering a different kind of certainty. Savonarola was born in Ferrara in 1452, the same year as Leonardo da Vinci. But while Leonardo embodied the spirit of the Renaissance with his curiosity and creativity, Savonarola was a different kind of soul. He was a serious, introspective child raised by his grandfather, a doctor who believed in old medieval ideas. Savonarola listened to his grandfather's warnings about the evils of the modern world and the importance of living a life of virtue. He was a gloomy, pale-faced youth who spent his time strumming mournful tunes on his lute and writing verses of depressing poetry. One day, Savonarola fell in love with a girl named Leodamia, the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy Florentine family. He proposed to her from his window, but she rejected him. This rejection deepened his aversion to the upper classes and the luxurious lifestyle they enjoyed. He grew to despise the new humanist ideas that were spreading, seeing them as a threat to traditional values. At the age of 23, during a celebration at his home, Savonarola decided he could no longer bear the wickedness of the world. He left in the middle of the night, walking 30 miles to Bologna, where he joined the Dominican order and became a monk. He wrote to his father, explaining that he needed to fight the devil and live a life of purity. Savonarola spent the next few years in various monasteries, living a life of extreme asceticism. He slept on a straw-filled pallet and avoided the relaxed celebrations of his fellow monks. When he was given the chance to preach, his sermons were initially unimpressive. He stuttered and mumbled, and no one paid much attention. But Savonarola was not one to give up easily. He prayed and fasted, seeking a purpose in life. In 1485, while serving in a small town called San Gimignano, Savonarola had a revelation. He felt called to reveal the word of God and warn the world of the coming disasters. He began delivering powerful sermons, castigating his congregation for their sins and predicting the fall of the church. His words were filled with passion and conviction, and people started to take notice. Word of this fiery preacher spread, and within 2 years, Savonarola was back in Florence, at the same monastery that Cosimo de' Medici had rebuilt, San Marco. One of his first listeners was Pico della Mirandola, a brilliant scholar who was struggling with his own doubts. Pico was moved by Savonarola's simple faith and deep knowledge of the Bible. He recommended Savonarola to Lorenzo de Medici, who was looking for a good preacher to help educate his young son, Giovanni, who had been made a cardinal at the age of 13. Savonarola's return to San Marco marked a turning point. His sermons became more intense, and he began to gain a following. He warned that the church was corrupt and needed to be purified. He spoke of a coming judgment, where the wicked would be punished and the righteous would be rewarded. His words resonated with many who felt disillusioned by the changes in Florence. As Savonarola's influence grew, So did the tension in the city. The Medici family, who had long been the patrons of the arts and new ideas, found themselves facing a challenge from this new voice of religious zeal. But for many, Savonarola offered a clear and uncompromising message in a world that seemed to be losing its way. His sermons gave them a sense of purpose and a call to return to a simpler, more virtuous life. Savonarola's message would soon have a profound impact on Florence, changing the course of its history and the lives of those who listened to him. But for now, he was just a monk with a powerful voice, speaking from the pulpit of San Marco, warning of the dangers that lay ahead. In the bustling city of Florence, the news of Lorenzo de Medici's son being made a cardinal stirred a wave of religious fervor. The citizens, who had grown weary and jaded, found a new purpose in the fiery sermons of a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. His powerful and uncompromising messages resonated deeply, especially with the poor, who saw their own struggles reflected in Christ's poverty and felt a sense of hope and reassurance. Even the humanists, who had embraced new ideas and philosophies, found themselves swayed by Savonarola's eloquent and passionate speeches. Savonarola, educated in the new humanist ideas, used his knowledge to challenge these very same ideas. He argued that while each person is responsible for their own soul, the ancient wisdom of the Church provided the true path to salvation. He criticized the humanists for their luxurious lifestyles and their preference for pagan myths over Christian teachings. He even accused artists of making the Virgin Mary look like a harlot, using garish colors and human details that detracted from the sacredness of their subjects. His sermons were so powerful that even the great artists of the time, like Sandro Botticelli and Angelo Poliziano, began to question their own work and the fate of their souls. During the summer of 1489, Savonarola delivered a series of lectures in the gardens of the San Marco monastery. Michelangelo, who was learning his craft at Lorenzo's nearby school of sculpture, was deeply impressed by Savonarola's passionate speeches. However, unlike many others, Michelangelo's strong faith and deep artistic vision remained unaffected by the friar's puritanical views. As Savonarola's influence grew, his sermons became more political. He began to criticize the misuse of power by the city's rulers, and his audience quickly recognized the tyrant he was referring to as Lorenzo de Medici. Despite this, Lorenzo initially tried to handle the situation with caution. He hoped that Savonarola would become more moderate over time, and he even sought advice from his trusted friends, Pico della Mirandola and Poliziano, who believed that Savonarola's religious ideas were sound and that his popularity provided a necessary outlet for the people's frustrations. However, Savonarola's rhetoric grew more intense. He compared the excesses of the modern rulers to those of historical tyrants like Nebuchadnezzar and Nero. In 1491, he was appointed prior of San Marco, and his sermons began attracting such large crowds that he was granted permission to preach in the cathedral. This only served to amplify his message, and it was not long before his sermons spread throughout the city, fueling resentment against Lorenzo's rule. Lorenzo, who was now suffering from the family's hereditary gout and arthritis, found himself in a difficult position. He considered asking the Pope to move Savonarola to another city, but Pope Innocent VIII was also ill and unable to act. The warnings Lorenzo sent to Savonarola through his supporters went unheeded, and the tensions continued to rise. On December 11, 1491, Lorenzo's son Giovanni, who had been appointed cardinal 3 years earlier, celebrated his coming of age. A grand celebration was held at the Palazzo Medici, but Lorenzo, too ill to attend, watched from an upper window. Just over 3 months later, on March 21, 1492, Lorenzo was carried to the Medici villa at Cergi, where he hoped to spend his final days. The city was filled with omens, including the death of 2 lions in a fight and a lightning strike that dislodged a marble ball from the cathedral's dome. These events were seen as bad omens, and Lorenzo, who was usually a rational man, could not help but feel a sense of foreboding. Lorenzo's condition worsened, and he summoned his eldest son, Piero, to his bedside. In a private moment, he advised Piero on the responsibilities of leadership, emphasizing the importance of humility and the welfare of the people. Lorenzo's illness had spread to his organs and bones, and he knew his time was limited. In a final, desperate attempt to secure his legacy, he sent for Savonarola. The friar made 3 demands: that Lorenzo repent, give up his wealth, and restore the liberty of the citizens. Lorenzo could only agree to the first demand, and Savonarola left without further discussion. On April 8, 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent died, leaving behind a city in turmoil. According to some accounts, the entire city followed Lorenzo to his grave, but others suggest that the public display of grief was not as widespread as the Medici claim. Regardless, Piero de Medici, now 21 years old, succeeded his father as the uncrowned Prince of Florence. Piero, who had a lot in common with his father, was confident and enjoyed the finer things in life. He had a high opinion of his artistic taste and considered himself a poet, though he was not particularly talented in this area. He continued to support the young Michelangelo, who had been a close companion during his childhood. Initially, Piero left the day-to-day governance of Florence to his father's experienced chancellor, Piero Davisi do Bibiena, and the management of the Medici Bank to the aging Giovanni Tornabuoni. However, Piero lacked the charm and political acumen of his father. The Medici political machine, which required constant attention and careful management, began to show signs of strain under his leadership. The bank, which had already closed its London and Bruges branches, was struggling, and the Florentine wool trade remained in decline, further fueling the discontent among the city's poor. Savonarola continued to preach, warning of an impending apocalypse and the coming of a foreign army that would ravage Italy. His prophecies, which had already proven true with the deaths of Lorenzo and Pope Innocent VIII, added to the growing anxiety in the city. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Italy was shifting. The ruler of Milan, Lodovico Sforza, refused to hand over power to the rightful heir, Gian Galeazzo, and appealed for support from Florence, Venice, and the Pope. When these requests were met with hesitation, Lodovico turned to Charles VIII of France, offering his support in exchange for help in claiming the throne of Naples. This move threatened the delicate balance of power that Lorenzo had maintained, and Italy teetered on the brink of war. Piero de Medici, now faced with the complex and volatile situation, found himself in a difficult position. His misjudgments and lack of understanding of the political dynamics would soon earn him the nickname Piero the Unfortunate. Despite his best intentions, the series of events that followed would test the limits of his leadership and the stability of the Medici rule in Florence. Unbeknown to all the Italian powers, Charles VIII of France had been waiting for just such an opportunity. He was the son of the Spider King Louis XI, who had cleverly made France the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe. Charles VIII became king at 13, but didn't take full control until 1491. He was a strange figure. He had a stooped posture, walked with a limp, and was rumored to have 6 toes on each foot. He was naive, gluttonous, and often talked to himself, which made people uneasy. Despite this, he had grand dreams of ruling a vast empire, fueled by his advisors who wanted him out of the country so they could pursue their own goals. They suggested that if France took control of Naples, it could then capture Constantinople and Jerusalem, securing the profitable trade routes to the Near East. Charles VIII liked this idea and was easily convinced. In January 1494, King Ferrante of Naples died, just as Savonarola had predicted. Ferrante's son, Alfonso II, became the new king. Charles VIII immediately claimed the right to the throne of Naples and threatened to use force to take it. This put all of Italy in danger, especially since the French army was huge and well equipped. Piero de Medici, the ruler of Florence, promised to defend Florence and support Naples against any foreign invasion. Many in Florence were worried, thinking that Savonarola's prophecies were coming true. However, not everyone was worried. The leading families of Florence still held festive balls to celebrate spring, but beneath the surface, tensions were growing. Piero's neglect of the Medici party machine and the financial troubles of the Medici Bank were causing problems. His cousins, Giovanni and Lorenzo di Pier Francesco de Medici, had become very wealthy through the grain trade and resented Piero's power. These tensions came to a head at a spring ball, when Piero and Giovanni argued over who should dance with a local beauty. Piero slapped Giovanni in the face, and Giovanni, unable to challenge Piero to a duel, left with bitterness. Piero, feeling the pressure, decided to act. He arrested Giovanni and Lorenzo, claiming they had sent a secret message to Charles VIII, saying that many in Florence would not oppose a march on Naples. In September 1494, Charles VIII led a massive French army into Italy. It was one of the largest armies ever to cross the Alps, and it was well equipped with mobile cannons and disciplined soldiers. The Italian armies, used to more tactical battles, were no match for the French. Lodovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, welcomed Charles VIII. Charles then visited the legitimate Duke of Milan, Gian Galeazzo, and his wife Isabella, who begged him not to attack Naples. Despite this, Charles continued his march south. Gian Galeazzo soon died, and Lodovico declared himself the rightful Duke of Milan. Alfonso II of Naples tried to stop the French but was defeated, and Charles VIII's army continued its advance. The Pope and Venice declared themselves neutral, leaving Florence as the last obstacle. Charles VIII demanded free passage through Tuscany to Naples. Piero, who had promised to defend Florence and Naples, found himself alone. After 5 days of silence, Charles VIII crossed into Tuscany, overran a border castle, and put all its garrison to the sword. He then demanded that Florence surrender. Florence was in chaos. Giovanni and Lorenzo di Francesco de Medici escaped from prison and joined Charles VIII, telling him that most Florentines wanted to surrender. Savonarola continued to preach fiery sermons, and the city needed a scapegoat. Piero decided to meet Charles VIII alone, hoping to save Florence as his father had done before. But Piero was no Lorenzo, and Charles was not as impressionable as Ferrante of Naples. Charles demanded control of the port cities of Pisa and Livorno, and Piero, in a weak moment, agreed to everything. When Piero returned to Florence, he was met with hostility. The Signoria, the city's ruling council, blamed him for the crisis and refused to let him enter the Palazzo della Signoria. The citizens, gathered by the ringing of the Vacca bell, jeered and threw stones at Piero and his men. Piero and his family fled into exile, and the Signoria formally banished them, setting rewards for their capture. Cardinal Giovanni, Piero's brother, tried to rally the Medici supporters but was met with boos and cries of Popolo e Libertà, people and liberty. Disguised as a Dominican monk, Giovanni gathered as many valuables as he could from the Palazzo Medici and fled the city. With the Medici gone, Florence entered a new era. The city had tired of Medici rule, and the economic downturn and Savonarola's fiery sermons had stirred a sense of republican pride. Piero de Medici, now known as Piero the Unfortunate, had faced bad luck and a rapidly changing political landscape. His downfall was not just a matter of personal weakness, but a result of the complex and volatile nature of Italian politics in the late 15th century. The Medici family, once the most powerful in Florence, found themselves suddenly cut off from their power base and forced into exile. Unlike when Cosimo de Medici was exiled 61 years earlier, this time there were no plans in place, and it soon became clear that this exile would not be a short one. As soon as Piero de Medici and his brother Cardinal Giovanni fled the city, the Medici party crumbled, and the family that had once ruled Florence was now openly despised. Piero and Giovanni's departure left a vacuum, and the Medici's assets were quickly seized by the city. Their palaces were looted, and the Medici emblems were stripped from the buildings. The Palazzo Medici, once a symbol of their wealth and power, was invaded by looters, but the city militia, sent by the Signoria, prevented it from being burned down. The Signoria took control of the Medici treasures, including Lorenzo's famous jewel collection and artworks, and even Donatello's statue of David was moved to the Piazza della Signoria. The Medici Bank, which was already struggling, was further weakened when the Signoria took 16,000 florins from its local branch. Despite this, some parts of the bank managed to survive, ensuring that the Medici would not completely disappear from the world of banking. The fall of the Medici was not just a local event. It had far-reaching consequences. Charles VIII of France, who had been welcomed by Piero de Medici, marched into Pisa, Florence's main port, and declared it liberated from Florentine rule. The Signoria, now in control, sent a delegation to Pisa, including the fiery preacher Girolamo Savonarola. In a bold and risky move, Savonarola addressed Charles VIII, welcoming him as God's instrument but warning him of divine retribution if he harmed Florence. Surprisingly, Charles VIII was impressed by Savonarola's conviction and did not punish him, a decision that likely saved Florence from a devastating attack. On November 17, 1494, Charles VIII entered Florence with his massive army. The city was occupied for 11 days, and the French king stayed in the Palazzo Medici. The citizens of Florence watched in awe as the French troops marched through the streets, and the city was largely spared from violence. However, the French demanded a heavy ransom of 150,000 florins, which the Signoria reluctantly agreed to pay. One of the most dramatic moments came when the Signoria, led by Piero di Gino Capponi, refused to pay the full ransom. Capponi, who had known Charles VIII since his childhood, tore up the treaty and declared, "If you sound your trumpets, we will ring our bells." Charles VIII, realizing the potential for a bloody uprising, accepted a reduced sum of 120,000 florins. With the French gone, Florence faced a new reality. The collapse of the Medici political machine left a void, and the city turned to Savonarola for guidance. His sermons, filled with calls for moral and spiritual renewal, drew huge crowds. Under his influence, the Signoria began to reform the government, making it more democratic. They overhauled the tax system, extended voting rights, and granted amnesty to exiles. Savonarola's vision went beyond political reform. He aimed to create a city of God, urging the people to give up their luxuries and focus on spiritual purity. His followers, including bands of children, collected items like jewelry and fine clothes, which were burned in the infamous bonfire of the Vanities. Meanwhile, Charles VIII's campaign in Naples continued. He entered the city unopposed and was crowned king, but his stay was short-lived. The Pope Alexander VI formed a holy league to drive the French out of Italy. Florence, under Savonarola's influence, refused to join, isolating the city from its neighbors. Charles VIII eventually left Naples, and his army spread a new disease, syphilis, across Europe. In the end, the fall of the Medici and the rise of Savonarola marked a dramatic shift in Florence. The city's brief experiment with a more democratic government was unique in Italy, but it was not without its challenges. Savonarola's radical reforms and the city's isolation would soon bring new tests, but for a time, Florence stood as a beacon of hope and change in a turbulent Italy.